Reprise du débat, the honourable member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm honoured to stand today to speak to C-65. And first and foremost, Mr. Speaker, because I don't want to forget, I just want to give a really big thank you and shout out to my former colleague, MP Daniel Blakey, who has done a tremendous amount of work on this file. And deserves acknowledgement for all of the work that he has done to date. Now I'm going to try to carry on the baton of work that he has handed to me. They're big shoes to fill, literally, but I will continue on this important work. Mr. Speaker, this is an important bill that we are talking about today. We know that it is vitally important that Canadians have access to voting in a way that is barrier-free, to increase participation of Canadians across the country in feeling like their vote counts. This is a time right now, Mr. Speaker, that is vitally important that Canadians know that our democracy is strong, that the process is accessible for everybody to vote. We are in a climate crisis. We're feeling the impacts of that right now in a heat wave here in Ottawa. We're seeing smoke-filled skies in British Columbia from forest fires, flooding. There's endless examples of the ways in which we are being impacted by the climate crisis. We know that people across Canada are struggling to make ends meet, struggling to put food on the table, struggling to keep a roof over their heads. Right now, Canadians deserve to know that our elections are fair, our elections are accessible, and that our democracy is strong. And so this is vitally important that we are doing the work today to set up Canadians for success for elections to come. Now, Mr. Speaker, this bill does a lot. One of the things, and I'll get into some of them, around 2 additional days of advanced voting. Now, this is really important because we know Canadians are busy, and we need to make sure that Canadians have access to be able to show up at the polls and cast their vote for the candidate that they feel is the best fit. Now, expanding these days out allows Canadians more options in being able to do so. There's going to be with the passing of this legislation, a phased implementation of voting anywhere. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that you have heard from constituents the same as I have in my riding of Nanaimo Ladysmith, that there are barriers when people go to vote in federal elections. They show up at the poll excited to cast their ballot, and they're told, you know what, actually the polling station that you need to go to is on the other side of town. Now, imagine, Mr. Speaker, the single mom who's worked all day, packing up her kids to get to the polling station to show her kids participating in our electoral system, and then to be told that she has to go to the other end of town. This is a huge barrier, and I hear this from constituents in my riding, but as well as Canadians across the country, that we need to know, similar to other levels of elections, that they can go to a polling station within their riding and know that their vote will be counted. Mr. Speaker, there's also improvements to the mail-in ballot process. We know that in previous elections there were barriers, particularly when people registered for mail-in ballots, and if they received it and they forgot to mail it back, which, this is busy times, of course this happens. If they showed up at the polling station to cast their vote and had already registered and received a mail-in ballot, they weren't able to cast their vote. Now, this is a huge problem and an issue that's being looked at in this legislation to ensure that people who do register for mail-in ballots can still vote at the polling station to make sure that their vote does count. Lots of good pieces. And so another piece, Mr. Speaker, is around students voting. Now, in 2015 and 2019, Mr. Speaker, we did have the Vote on Campus programs, where we saw big turnouts of students showing up at the polls to cast their ballots. And then, unfortunately, that is no longer in place. Now, this legislation would make the Vote on Campus program a permanent in all general elections. Now, this is vitally important for students to know that while they're on campus, they can easily and accessibly cast their ballots. This also offers an additional option for community members in the surrounding area to have another poll that they can go and cast their ballots at. So this is really important at a time when we need young people to be participating in our elections. It is ultimately their futures that we are making decisions about today, and this is a really important part of this bill. Another piece, Mr. Speaker, is around long-term care polling stations. Now, long-term care polling stations, we know that there are many people across the country are aging in long-term care homes, and to know that they do not need to leave their residence, that they can instead cast their ballot right at home at their care home is a huge step to make sure that the people that have contributed to our communities across the country for years and years can continue to have their votes heard or seen. Now, Mr. Speaker, another piece that I'd like to point out that's not in this legislation, but something that I would love for us to dig into further at committee stage, is ensuring that we see an increase of polling stations and having those polling stations as mandatory on reserves and Métis settlements. We know because of the impacts of colonization throughout history that there are many reasons why we are not seeing the participation at the level that it should be of Indigenous people across the country. This is a step in the right direction to make sure that Indigenous people are able to vote accessibly right at home amongst community members. Now, Mr. Speaker, I found it interesting to learn one piece, actually just today in Article 5 of UNDRIP, which I just want to reiterate as a very important piece to this discussion that I hope to have at committee. Now, Article 5 of UNDRIP says Indigenous people have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinct political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions while retaining the right to participate fully, if they so choose, in the political, economic, social, and cultural life of the state. Now, I read that out, Mr. Speaker, one, because it is in UNDRIP, which is vitally important work that we all need to be paying attention to and prioritizing, but also around the fact that this could help to ensure that Indigenous people understand their rights when they show up at the polls to vote for their candidate that they see as the best fit at the federal level. This is work that needs to happen and needs to be prioritized, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, another piece of this legislation is around making sure that, and this is something that I spoke to earlier in a question, is ensuring that people who may be living with disabilities, as one example, are able to cast their ballots. Currently, there are restrictions on who can assist in casting ballots, and this legislation is working to address that, to broaden the scope of who can support, or specifically allowing the electorate to choose who can assess them. So, for example, somebody could have a support worker to cast the ballot on their behalf, which is very important work in the right direction to make sure that everybody's votes can count. Now, in addition to this, Mr. Speaker, my hope is that once this gets to committee, yes, again, I'm an eternal optimist and hope that we can come together to see this at committee. But we need to be looking at ways in which people with disabilities can maintain their autonomy and to be able to cast their ballot independently without the support of other individuals. Now, it's great to set up those systems of support, and where we can, let's set up a system where all Canadians can show up at the ballot and know that they can confidently and successfully cast their own ballot. I think about the tremendous amount of people who are reaching out with visual impairments as just one example. People with visual impairments could cast their own ballot if the systems were set up for them to do that on their own. And so this is important that we are looking at this, Mr. Speaker. Now, another piece, Mr. Speaker, that I wanted to cover on here is around the inclusion of Inuktitut on federal ballots. Now, this is vitally important. Mr. Speaker, I had the honor of visiting my colleague, the member from Nunavut. In Nunavut, we visited Pegnerton and Iqaluit, and it is quite evident that there are a tremendous amount of individuals living in Nunavut who speak Inuktitut as their primary and first language. And so making sure that the ballots have the language spoken by the residents in the area is vitally important to decrease barriers in participation, to ensure that people are understanding confidently who it is that they're voting for. My colleague, the MP from Nunavut, has been doing an incredible amount of work on this, Mr. Speaker. The member has put forward, for example, Bill C-297 that I wanted to highlight, which, Mr. Speaker, the goal of this bill is that in an electoral district that is on Indigenous land, the chief electoral officer may require that all the ballots for the electoral district be prepared and printed in both official languages as well as in the Indigenous language or languages of the electors, using the appropriate writing systems for each language, including syllabics, if applicable. Now, this is really important that we are listening to Indigenous people across the country and making sure that ballots are accessible for them to be able to vote as well. And this is an example of important legislation that the government can be leaning on to move us in the right direction. And I hope that this is legislation that we will be reviewing very closely at committee stage. Now, the MP from Nunavut, now I know, Mr. Speaker, I have quite a bit of time. Good, I'll continue on here. The MP for Nunavut did actually participate in the process of a report from the Standing Committee on Procedural and House Affairs that's titled The Inclusion of Indigenous Languages on Federal Election Ballots, a Step Towards Reconciliation. And there was a couple of pieces in here, Mr. Speaker, that I wanted to highlight. The MP for Nunavut pointed out that most elders in Nunavut cannot read English or French, so this expands on what I was just talking about. And she speaks to the fact that in order to make reconciliation meaningful, Indigenous languages needed to be protected and promoted. She went on to point out, Mr. Speaker, that unilingual Inuktitut speakers find the complaints process inaccessible, so it makes it challenging for them to be able to voice the barriers that they are experiencing in being able to cast their ballots as a result of previous oppressive systems that they have experienced. And also, Mr. Speaker, the MP for Nunavut told the committee that she heard of people who've been turned away from voting in Nunavut because of language barriers. Now, Mr. Speaker, this is clearly not good enough and something that we need to be looking at closely in committee to make sure that we are moving in the right direction. Now, Mr. Speaker, this bill does have some pieces that we need to make sure that we are looking at committee stage. One piece is around the third-party activities. Now, I'd like to reiterate that it is vitally important that unions are able to communicate with their members. We know that at the core of a union's mandate and function is the ability to communicate freely and effectively with members. Mr. Speaker, workers across the country who are unionized are impacted traumatically by the decisions that are being made right here in this House. We know that these decisions are life altering. They are important that people across the country are aware of these, and it is vitally important that unions are able, union representatives are able to communicate these matters with their membership. And so with that, there is some work that needs to happen and needs to be prioritized at committee stage to ensure that this bill is not taking away those rights of unions across the country. And Mr. Speaker, I would be remiss if I didn't speak about the issue that seems to be coming up over and over again in this House. Now, there was a date proposed to push forward the date of the election by 1 week in this legislation. Now, unfortunately, this is highly problematic. The reason for this is because the unintended or intended, I really can't speak to any other members' intentions, but the consequence of this is that members of Parliament would be receiving a pension that they would not have otherwise been eligible for. Now, right, as I said at the beginning of my speech, Mr. Speaker, there are so many across the country who are struggling to make ends meet. Now is not the time for members of Parliament to be thinking about their own financial gain or their own pensions. Now is the time for members of Parliament to be creating legislation that truly helps Canadians across the country. And so I want to reiterate that first priority. Once we get this to committee, I will be moving an amendment to ensure that this date is moved back to the original date so that this is no longer a concern of members of Parliament and Canadians across the country. Mr. Speaker, it is vitally important that we are doing what this legislation intends to do, which is strengthening our democracy, which is making sure that we are reducing barriers for people to be able to fully participate in our electoral system. There is important content within this legislation that we need to be moving forward with. Now, Mr. Speaker, much to my surprise, but yet also not much to my surprise, in response to this portion of the legislation, the Conservatives came out with an amendment to cut and gut the entire legislation, to see this legislation no longer moving forward at all. So with that, it would take all of the items that I have been talking about during my intervention today, Mr. Speaker. With that, it would take the increasing accessibility for people living with disabilities, having polls on long-term care homes, having polls on student campuses, looking at increasing the advanced polling days so that we're not so reliant on just one day. There are many important aspects in this bill, and to see the Conservatives respond by saying, well, we just need to cut the whole thing is not surprising, Mr. Speaker, because currently we have a system that benefits them. We know that the existing system where we have barriers in participation that benefits the Conservatives' corporate friends is exactly what they want to see maintained. And so, Mr. Speaker, instead of putting forward an amendment to cut and gut this legislation, my NDP colleagues and I are proposing a solution to the problem, which is amending the existing legislation to move it back to the original date and to see this particular issue no longer in place so that we can move forward with strengthening our democracy and making sure that Canadians can fully participate in the electoral processes. Now, Mr. Speaker, there is a lot of work that needs to be done to strengthen our democracy. This is an important step in the right direction, which of course I'm fully in support of. The NDP has done a tremendous amount of work to make this legislation happen, to see all of this work being put into place. There is more that needs to be done. I hope that my colleagues in this chamber will continue the important work of looking at electoral reform, looking at implementing a system of proportional representation. Mr. Speaker, the Liberal Party campaigned on the 2015 election being the last first past the post election. Now would be a really wonderful time to see the Liberals following through with that promise so that Canadians can see their votes adequately and effectively represented right here in the House of Commons. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I will say that this is an important bill. There's some work that needs to be done, but I think that it is vitally important that all members unite together to see Canadians showing up at polling stations, feeling confident in our democracy and confident in their vote. Thank you.
Questions and comments. I think the honourable member for Torres-Blainville has tried several times, so it's her turn. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You have a good sense of observation. Well, at the block, if you remove this idea of delaying the election date to the third Monday of the month of October for a reason that doesn't make any sense, I'm just wondering how this ended up in the bill. How come it's here already? We're having a discussion saying that the NDP will bring forth an amendment. If it goes to committee, everyone seems to want to move an amendment on this. But right now, why don't we just adopt this bill so it goes to committee and getting rid of this issue of delaying the election day? So for me, it's a question of we don't want to have to live with this issue. The honourable member for Nanaimo-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Et je remercie.
I'd like to thank my colleague.
A couple of responses around that. First of all, I'm so pleased to hear that the member is in support of this legislation for us to get it to committee and to be able to ensure that we are moving the right direction. I'm seeing a no, but I would like to clarify. That's what I heard, so I apologize if that's not what the member was saying. Now, to clarify, first thing is that this legislation needs to make sure that it is looking at increasing accessibility for Canadians to be able to cast their ballots. We do need to be looking at other things that are happening in those timelines. Now, I believe that the strength in this legislation is us looking at not having all of our options on one day. So looking at having it so that Canadians have multiple ways in which they can participate in our elections. So expanding the advance voting days, having the polling stations accessible and available. We need to be not having just one day as the main day, and that'll help resolve many of the issues we're talking about here today.
Question commentaire, questions and comments. The Honourable Deputy House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I mean, this whole issue around changing the election date, I appreciate and I support the member's initiative to change the date. Maybe in committee they'll even find that a week earlier is better because it kind of helps to accomplish a bunch of things, so I think that that's great. But I took note with her issue that she talked about proportional representation. And I go back to the supply and confidence agreement between the Liberals and the NDP. And the issues that they list under democracy are a commitment to work with Elections Canada to expand voter participation, a change to the election rules to allow people to vote at any polling place, improvements to mail-in ballots so that voters are not disenfranchised, and a commitment to ensuring the number of seats in Quebec at the House of Commons remains consistent. There was no talk in the supply and confidence agreement with the Liberals about proportional representation. If it's an issue that's so important to the NDP, why didn't they bring it up and put it into that agreement?
The Honourable Member for Nanaimo-Ladysmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm so happy that the member has brought up this very important question. Now, first and foremost, this is an issue that was brought up by the NDP, and I know this as a fact over time with the Liberals to try to get this into the supply and confidence agreement. We could not get the Liberals to agree. So this is an unfortunate series of events. But now I'd like to reiterate that there was an opportunity aside from this legislation that we're talking about today for the Liberals to show their support for proportional representation, for electoral reform. When I brought forward motion 86 recently, which came to a vote in this exact chamber for members of Parliament to vote for a National Citizens Assembly on electoral reform where Canadians can provide their voice on how to best move forward. Now, unfortunately, many of the Liberals, and I hear that the member voted in favor, but many of the Liberals and Conservatives, I'd like to say the Conservative Liberal coalition, voted against this motion moving forward. And so we did not see M86 pass. Perhaps the Liberals can, as in the position of power that they are in, could put forward legislation to see electoral reform happen.
Well done.
So many coalitions. Questions and comments, l'honorable député.
The honourable member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank and congratulate my colleague for Nanaimo Ladysmith for her work and her speech. What we're seeing today with this bill is once again the NDP's work that forces the Liberals to enhance the voting system and accessibility for people. But as my colleague said, that's the minimum for us. But we have greater ambitions. And her motion, M86, which was defeated by the Liberals and the Conservatives, well, after the Liberals promised that was broken, saying that we'll never have another election under the first past the post system. So after that betrayal, the NDP has continued to work in favor of a proportional representation system. That's what's fair. That is what respects the desire and will of citizens. How come we can't have a proportional system? It's very fundamental for our democracy. The honourable member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the member for all of his work. Mr. Speaker, one thing that gave me optimism when putting forward M86, despite it failing, was that I did see members from across party lines voting in favor of us looking at how do we improve our electoral system, how do we strengthen our democracy. And so this gives me the optimism to believe that, just because M86 did not pass, it does not mean that there are not opportunities that members of Parliament can be taking right here in this House to see it happen. The Liberal government is in power right now. They can make it happen today. They can follow through with their promise to see the 2015 election being the last first past the post, although, you know what, it's too late for that. How about this? The next upcoming election will no longer be a first past the post election, and we can move forward with a system of proportional representation. We can see that happen today. We can see the Liberals follow through with their promise, although with a very long delay, and my hope is that we'll see that happen. Thank you.
Questions et commentaires?
Questions and comments?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I do want to pick up on the fact that within this legislation, there's a lot of aspects of it that provide strength to the Elections Act. It'll make it stronger, healthier, better for Canadians as a whole and our democratic system. And I cited things such as, the enhancing of accountability for individuals donating to the campaign, issues like cryptocurrency and other ways in which there was a need to shed more light. I'm wondering if the member can just provide her thoughts or amplify her thoughts in regards to some of the things that we don't necessarily talk too much about during this debate, but there's a lot of detail within the legislation that will, in fact, add a great deal of value and strength to our elections.
The Honourable Member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the member for his question. I think if anything has been shed to light in the last few months is the importance of all legislation looking at the potential of foreign interference, looking at the prevention of foreign interference, looking at the identification of foreign interference. It needs to be implemented in all legislation. Yes, there are some components within this that look at addressing those. As the member mentioned, the type of payments or donations that are being made, not being allowed through money orders or cryptocurrencies, also looking at who can donate, making sure that they're permanent residents and Canadian residents. These are components that are part of a bigger puzzle of work that we need to be doing together to make sure that foreign interference is identified, prevented, and avoided altogether, and also held to account when it does happen. I was happy happy to see all members of Parliament voting together on the recent Foreign Interference Bill, M70, and my hope is that we'll see that work and this work strengthened so that this no longer is as problematic as as has been coming to light in the last few months.